Out on the plains, the wind doesn't just whisper, it tells tales. Tales of desperation, of survival, and of the ghosts that ride with every lonely soul. For Clara May Thompson, a woman wrestling a cattle ranch from the unforgiving Wyoming soil, the wind was her only companion. Until the day it blew in a half-dead stranger, his body starved but his eyes holding a story darker than a winter storm. She offered him a bowl of soup abed by the fire. She thought she was saving him from the cold, but she had no idea she was inviting a reckoning right to her door. The silence of the Thompson Creek Ranch was a living thing. It pressed in on all sides, a constant heavy blanket, broken only by the mournful cry of the wind whipping down from the Bighorn Mountains or the low, rumbling complaint of a restless steer. For Clara May Thompson, the silence had been a companion for 2 years, ever since the fever had taken her husband, Frank, and left her the sole proprietor of 3,000 acres of unforgiving Wyoming territory. At 32, Clara was a woman forged by hardship. Her hands, calloused and capable, could rope a calf, mend a fence, and handle a Winchester with equal proficiency. Her face framed by strands of sun-bleached brown hair that had escaped her tight bun was etched with the fine lines of worry and work, but her eyes the color of a summer sky, just before a storm held a fierce, unyielding light. She was lonely, a deep, gnawing loneliness that ached in her bones on cold nights, but she was not weak. Weakness was a luxury she could not afford. The first snows of 1888 had come early, dusting the golden plains with a layer of pristine white. It was a beautiful, treacherous sight. It meant the cattle needed to be moved to the sheltered pastures, that the woodpile needed to be taller than a man, and that any trip to Redemption Gulch, the nearest dusty outpost of civilization, was a calculated risk. Clara was in the barn, forking hay into the mangers for her 2 sturdy geldings, when she first saw him. He was a silhouette at first, a dark smudge against the blinding white of the snow-covered valley, stumbling toward the ranch with the lurching, uneven gait of a man at the end of his rope. Her first instinct was suspicion. It was a reflex as natural as breathing. A lone man in this wilderness was either a fool or a danger, and she had little time for either. She set down the pitchfork, her hand going to the worn holster on her hip, where Frank's old Colt revolver rested. She watched from the shadows of the barn as he drew closer, his form taking shape. He was tall but gaunt, his clothes little more than rags, hanging from a skeletal frame. He wasn't walking so much as he was falling forward, catching himself and then falling forward again. He collapsed less than 50 yards from her front porch, a dark heap in the snow. Clara remained where she was for a long minute, her heart a hard, rhythmic drum against her ribs. Every story she'd ever heard about drifters, outlaws, and desperate men ran through her mind. Leaving him there was the smart thing to do. By morning, the snow and the cold would have solved the problem for her. It was the law of the plains. But then she saw it, a slight, almost imperceptible rise and fall of his back. He was still alive. Cursing herself for a fool, Clara strode out of the barn, her boots crunching in the fresh snow, the Colt now firm in her hand. Up close, he was worse than she'd imagined. His face was a mask of frost and grime, his lips blue and cracked. A rough, untamed beard covered his jaw, but it couldn't hide the hollows of his cheeks. He looked more like a corpse than a living man. She nudged him with the toe of her boot. A low groan escaped his lips. "Mister, can you hear me?" Duh. Her voice was sharp, devoid of pity. His eyelids fluttered. They opened a crack, revealing eyes so pale a blue they were almost grey, clouded with exhaustion and pain. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. Clara let out a frustrated sigh. She couldn't just leave him. Whatever her head told her, her heart, a stubborn and foolish organ, wouldn't allow it. "Don't you die on my land, you hear me?" She muttered, more to herself than to him. "I've got enough graves to dig." With a strength that would have surprised most men, she hauled him up. He was shockingly light. She half dragged, half carried him to the small cabin, the smell of pine smoke from her chimney, a welcome promise of warmth. She deposited him unceremoniously on the rag rug in front of the stone hearth, his head lolling to the side. For a moment she thought the effort had killed him, but the flicker of his pulse at his neck was thready but persistent. She worked with a grim efficiency, stripping off his frozen threadbare coat and boots. His feet were swollen and raw with frostbite. Underneath his clothes were thin and worn, offering no real protection from the elements. He had no gun, no saddlebags, no horse. He had nothing but the rags on his back and the life shivering within him. She wrapped him in a thick wool blanket and propped his head up with a pillow. Then she went to the stove and ladled a thin broth saved from the night before into a bowl. Kneeling beside him, she lifted his head and brought the spoon to his lips. At first he didn't respond. She dipped her finger in the broth and touched it to his mouth. His tongue snaked out, tasting it. A flicker of life returned to his eyes. Slowly, painstakingly, she fed him. He choked and sputtered, but he got the broth down. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. She tended to his frost-bitten feet, her touch gentle but businesslike, wrapping them in clean rags. Through it all, he watched her with those pale, haunted eyes, saying nothing. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. The firelight played across his face, revealing the hard lines of a life lived on the edge. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps her age or a little less. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice still hard. He swallowed, his throat working. When he finally spoke, his voice was a raw whisper. "Jedediah. Jedediah Stone." "Well, Jedediah Stone," she said, rising to her feet and placing the revolver back on the mantelpiece in plain sight. "You can have the floor by the fire for the night. You give me one reason to regret this, and I'll put you back out in the snow myself. You understand?" He gave a slow, deliberate nod. His gaze fixed on her. Then his eyes drifted closed, and he was lost to a sleep so deep it looked like death. Clara stood over him for a long time, the silence of the ranch pressing in once more. Only now it wasn't empty. It was filled with the presence of the stranger, a question mark lying on her floor, a life she had, for better or worse, just saved. The first week was a trial. Jedediah, or Jed, as she'd taken to calling him. In her own mind, slept for most of the first 3 days, waking only when Clara forced more broth or watered down milk between his lips. He was a presence in her small cabin, a disruption to the solitary rhythm she had cultivated. She found herself watching him constantly, her senses on high alert. She slept with the Colt on the nightstand beside her bed. The door to her small bedroom left ajar. On the 4th day, she woke to find him sitting up his back against the stone hearth, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The wool blanket was wrapped tightly around his shoulders. He looked up as she entered the main room, and for the first time, his eyes were clear. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice stronger, though still rough. "It is," she replied curtly, moving to the stove to start the coffee. You're looking less like a ghost." A faint smile touched his chapped lips. "Feeling less like one. I owe you my life, ma'am. I don't know how I can repay you. You can start by telling me what you were doing, wandering in a blizzard with no horse and no gear," she said, not turning from her task. The question hung in the air between them, sharp and pointed. He was quiet for a long moment. "Looking for work. Got caught in the storm. My horse went lame, had to put him down a few days back. Lost my pack in a river crossing." The explanation was simple, plausible. Yet Clara felt it was an edited version of a much longer story. She turned a cup of coffee in her hand and studied him. "What kind of work?" "Any kind, ma'am. I can ride, I can rope, I can mend just about anything that's broken." Clara thought of the sagging fence line on the north pasture, the leaky roof on the barn, the endless list of chores that were piling up too much for one person to handle. She was heading into winter, understaffed and overworked. Frank had always hired an extra hand or two, but she didn't have the coin for that, not with cattle prices being what they were. The pay is a roof over your head and 3 meals a day until the spring thaw, she said, her tone making it clear it was not a negotiation. "You'll sleep in the barn, you'll work from sunup to sundown, and you'll keep to yourself." Agreed. Relief washed over his face, so profound it was startling. "Agreed, ma'am. And thank you." From that day on, a new routine was established. Jed, it turned out, was a man of his word. He was also a man who understood work. As his strength returned with startling speed, fueled by Clara's plain but plentiful cooking, he threw himself into the endless tasks of the ranch. He rose before she did the sound of him chopping wood, a new, not unwelcome rhythm to her mornings. He had a quiet competence that impressed her. He didn't just mend the fence. He reset the posts and stretched the wire until it was taut and true. He didn't just patch the barn roof. He re-shingled the entire section, his movements economical and precise. He had a way with the horses, a low, gentle murmur that calmed even her most skittish mare. He worked with a relentless, driving energy, as if trying to outrun the demons that still flickered in the depths of his pale eyes. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the wall of Clara's suspicion began to crumble, worn down by the steady drip of his labor and his quiet respect. They ate their meals together at the small kitchen table. The silence between them was no longer tense and watchful, but comfortable, companionable. She would talk about the ranch, the cattle, the challenges she faced. He was a good listener, his gaze attentive, his questions intelligent. He spoke little of himself, and she found she no longer pressed him for details. The man he was now was more important than the man he had been. One afternoon, a month after his arrival, the uneasy peace was shattered. Clara was mending a harness on the porch when she saw the rider approaching. It was Bartholomew Bart Higgins, her nearest neighbor. Bart was a large, imposing man with a prosperous gut and a face that was always a little too florid. He owned the sprawling Bar H Ranch to the east, and for the past 2 years he had been making Clara's life difficult. He'd made no secret of the fact that he wanted her land, her water rights in particular. He'd started with offers to buy, which had escalated to thinly veiled threats about a woman's ability to run a ranch alone. "Clara May," he boomed, dismounting his big bay horse with a grunt. His eyes swept the property, a look of smug assessment on his face. "Place is still standing, I see. It'll outlast us both." "Bart," she replied coolly, not bothering to stand. His gaze fell on Jed, who was coming out of the barn carrying a bucket of water. Bart's eyes narrowed. Well now, who's this? Didn't figure you for hiring help. This is Jed Stone. Clara said, her voice even. He's helping me out for the winter. Bart looked Jed up and down, his lip curling in a sneer. He saw the worn clothes, the gauntness that still clung to Jed's frame. A drifter, eh? You want to be careful, Clara. You never know what kind of trouble a man like that is running from. Jed stopped, his expression unreadable. He set the bucket down and met Bart's gaze, a quiet stillness in his posture that was more intimidating than any overt threat. I'm not running from anything, he said, his voice low and steady. I'm running to work. Bart let out a short, humorless laugh. Is that what they call it these days? He turned his attention back to Clara, his tone becoming condescendingly sweet. Now, Clara, we both know this is too much for you. The offer still stands. A fair price. You could move to town, be comfortable, find a husband to take care of you. His eyes flickered toward Jed again, a clear, insulting insinuation in the glance. Clara's knuckles were white where she gripped the leather harness. I have a husband, Bart. He's buried on that hill. And I'm not selling. Not now, not ever. Now, unless you've got business here, you're on my land. Bart's face hardened. The faux charming facade dropped, revealing the bully underneath. You'll change your mind. Winter's long and hard. A lot can happen. He swung himself back onto his horse, gave Jed one last venomous look, and rode off his back stiff with anger. Clara watched him go, a cold knot of dread in her stomach. She knew his threat wasn't idle. When she turned, Jed was still standing there, his pale eyes fixed on the retreating figure. He bothers you often, Jed asked the question soft. He wants the ranch. He wants more than that. Jed said, his gaze meeting hers. For the first time, she saw something other than gratitude or weariness in his eyes. It was a fierce, protective glint, an emotion she hadn't seen directed at her since Frank was alive. That night, a blizzard descended, burying the ranch in a sea of white. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the windows of the small cabin. They were cut off from the world, isolated in a swirling vortex of snow and ice. The storm forced Jed from the barn and into the cabin. There was nowhere else for him to go. He laid his bedroll by the fire, just as he had that first night. But this time, it was different. The space between them had shrunk. The cabin, once her solitary fortress, now felt shared. They sat by the fire, the storm raging outside, a small island of warmth and light in the vast, frozen darkness. He told her a story about growing up in Missouri, a funny tale about a runaway pig. She found herself laughing, a genuine, unrestrained laugh that felt foreign and wonderful in her own throat. She looked at him at the way the firelight caught the sharp angles of his face and warmed the cool grey of his eyes. She saw the strength in his hands, the quiet dignity in his posture. She saw a good man, a kind man. And in the heart of the storm, surrounded by the silence of the snow, Clara May Thompson admitted a dangerous truth to herself. She was no longer afraid of the stranger on her floor. She was afraid of what she was beginning to feel for him. The blizzard raged for 4 days, entombing the Thompson Creek Ranch in a world of white. The forced proximity changed everything. The professional distance Clara had tried to maintain dissolved in the shared, simple intimacies of survival. They moved around the small cabin in a silent, practiced rhythm, tending the fire-melting snow for water rationing the food. The boundaries of employer and hired hand blurred into something softer, more personal. In the long, dark evenings with the wind screaming outside, they talked. Jed was still guarded about his past, offering only vague sketches of a hard Scrabble life, but he coaxed stories from her. She found herself telling him about Frank, about their dreams for the ranch. The memories tinged not with the sharp pain of fresh grief, but with a gentle, bittersweet nostalgia. He listened with an attentiveness that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. A fragile, unspoken intimacy bloomed between them in the fire-lit cabin, as delicate and beautiful as a frost flower on a window pane. When the storm finally broke, the world was reborn dazzling and silent under a blanket of pristine snow. The path to Redemption Gulch was impassable for another week, but neither of them seemed to mind. The work was hard, digging out paths to the barn and the chicken coop, checking on the half-frozen cattle. But they did it together. A sense of partnership settled over them, comfortable and right. Eventually, the need for supplies became urgent. Clara knew they had to make the trip to town. The thought filled her with a strange apprehension. Their isolated world had been a sanctuary. Exposing their fragile bond to the prying eyes of Redemption Gulch felt like a violation. The sleigh ride to town was cold, but beautiful. Jed handled the horses with his usual quiet confidence, while Clara sat beside him wrapped in a thick buffalo robe. The 10 miles passed in comfortable silence, but as they guided the sleigh down the town's main street, Clara's anxiety proved justified. Heads turned. Conversations ceased. People stopped and stared from behind the frosty windows of the general store and the saloon. She saw the whispers pass from one person to another, like a contagion. They saw Clara May Thompson, the widow with a strange man at her side. A man who was clearly not just a day laborer. They saw scandal, and they savored it. Inside Miller's general store, the air was thick with unspoken questions. Mrs. Miller, the town's primary purveyor of goods and gossip, gave Jed a long, searching look. Running low on supplies, Clara, she asked, her tone dripping with false sweetness. Winter's been hard on everyone, especially those alone. Clara ignored the insinuation, her voice crisp as she read from her list. While she was dealing with Mrs. Miller, Jed moved towards the back of the store. Clara's eyes followed him. She saw him pause near the wall where the sheriff, a perpetually weary man named Brody, posted public notices. Jed froze his body, going rigid. He stared at a piece of paper on the wall for a long second before turning abruptly, his face pale and shuttered. A cold dread trickled down Clara's spine. While Jed loaded their supplies into the sleigh, she made an excuse to go back inside. Her heart pounded as she walked to the notice board. And then she saw it. It was a wanted poster issued from a county in Colorado. The drawing was crude, but the likeness was unmistakable. The high cheekbones, the straight nose, the intense pale eyes. It was Jed, but the name printed in bold letters at the top was not Jedediah Stone. It was Caleb the Ghost Donovan. Wanted $500 reward for information leading to the arrest of Caleb Donovan and the rest of the Kane gang for the robbery of the Durango Silverton stagecoach. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. The air rushed from her lungs. Kane! The name echoed in her memory, from whispered stories told by freighters and travelers. Silas Kane, a notoriously ruthless outlaw, whose gang had terrorized the territories for years. She ripped the poster from the wall. Her hands, shaking, crumpled it in her fist and fled the store. The ride back to the ranch was a long, agonizing torture. The comfortable silence was gone, replaced by a chasm of betrayal. betrayal and fear. Jed must have sensed her turmoil, but he said nothing, his own silence a heavy, guilty weight. She waited until they were back in the cabin, the door shut against the cold and the rest of the world. She threw the crumpled poster onto the table between them. It uncurled slowly, revealing the face that was both familiar and terrifyingly alien. "Explain this," she said. Her voice a low, trembling whisper. Jed looked at the poster, then at her face. The color drained from his. He slumped into a chair, as if his legs could no longer hold him. "Clara, Is that you?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Are you Caleb Donovan?" He swallowed hard and nodded, his gaze fixed on the wooden tabletop. It was. "That's not who I am now." "Not who you are," she cried, the betrayal, a bitter taste in her mouth. "You're a wanted man, a stagecoach robber, a member of the Kane gang. My God, I've had an outlaw sleeping by my fire for 2 months. Have you been laughing at me this whole time, the lonely widow so desperate for a little help she'd take in a viper?" "No." He looked up then, and the anguish in his eyes was so profound it stopped her cold. "No, never. Clara, you have to believe me. Everything I've been here with you, that's the real me. Caleb Donovan. He was a ghost, a stupid, scared kid who made a terrible mistake." He began to talk, the words pouring out of him in a torrent, as if a dam had finally broken. He'd run away from a hard life in Missouri, fallen in with Silas Kane's crew, because they offered food and what looked like protection. He was just a horse holder, a lookout. He swore he'd never hurt anyone. The stagecoach robbery had gone wrong. A guard was killed not by him, but by one of Kane's lieutenants. That was the moment he knew he had to run. He'd slipped away in the night, taking nothing with him, and had been on the move ever since changing his name, trying to shed his past like a snake sheds its skin. "Silas Kane isn't a man you just walk away from," Jed whispered, his voice hoarse. "He'd as soon kill me as look at me. I ran, and I kept running until I ended up here. I was starving, Clara. I was ready to die. And then you opened your door." Clara sank into her own chair, her mind reeling. His story was plausible, compelling. The sincerity in his voice, the raw pain in his eyes, it felt real. But she had been a fool. She had let her loneliness, her growing affection for this man, blind her to the truth. She had built a fragile trust on a foundation of lies. She looked at the man across the table. Jedediah Stone, Caleb Donovan. A stranger she had let into her home, and worse, into her heart. The fire in the hearth crackled, the only sound in the suffocating silence. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the snow in hues of pink and grey. It looked beautiful and cold, just like the man sitting before her. "You have to leave," she said, the words feeling like stones in her throat. "When the sun comes up, you take a horse, you take enough food for 3 days, and you ride out, and you don't ever come back." He didn't argue. He just nodded, the light in his eyes, finally extinguishing, leaving nothing but a hollow, haunted grey. A bitter, unseasonal storm blew in during the night, a howling gale of wind and ice that seemed a physical manifestation of the turmoil inside the cabin. It slammed against the walls and screamed down the chimney, erasing the trail to Redemption Gulch and trapping them together in a prison of suffocating tension. Morning came, but the world outside was a churning maelstrom of white. Jed couldn't leave. He didn't try to speak to her. He stayed by the hearth, a silent, brooding figure, while Clara moved about the cabin. Her movements stiff and angry. Every glance she stole at him was a fresh twist of the knife. The man who had mended her fences and soothed her horses, the man whose quiet presence had filled the empty spaces in her life, was a phantom. She had fallen for a ghost. The shame and hurt were a physical ache in her chest. Meanwhile, in Redemption Gulch, the whispers had found fertile ground. Bart Higgins had seen Clara snatch the wanted poster. He'd put 2 and 2 together and arrived at a sum that suited his ambitions perfectly. He cornered Sheriff Brody in the saloon, his voice booming with righteous indignation. "That drifter she's keeping is Caleb the Ghost," Donovan Bart declared, slapping the bar for emphasis. "There's a price on his head. He's a killer, and he's holed up with that poor, foolish widow. Who knows what he's done to her already? We can't just wait for the storm to pass. We have to do something." Sheriff Brody, a man who preferred paperwork to gun smoke, sighed into his whiskey. "It's a Colorado warrant, Bart, and I'm not losing a posse in this blizzard on your say-so. To hell with the law." Another man slurred from a nearby table. "It's $500. That was all the encouragement Bart needed. He saw an opportunity not just to claim a reward, but to rid himself of his rival and terrorize Clara into selling. He gathered a half-dozen of his own hired hands and a few barflies drunk on greed and cheap liquor. A vigilante posse fueled by rumor and whiskey riding into a blizzard. It was a recipe for disaster. Late in the afternoon, through a momentary lull in the screaming wind, Clara heard it. The jingle of harnesses and the muffled thud of hooves in deep snow. She peered through a frosted window pane, and her blood ran cold. A group of riders' dark figures against the swirling white were making their way toward the cabin. She recognized Bart Higgins in the lead. "Jed," she said, her voice sharp with alarm. He was on his feet instantly, his eyes following her gaze to the window. The shuttered look was gone, replaced by a grim, weary resignation. "It's Higgins," he said. "He must have seen you take the poster." "What does he want?" "The reward," Jed said simply. "And to see me hang." He looked around the cabin, his gaze falling on the Winchester resting above the door. "Clara, you need to tell them I forced you. Tell them I held you captive." "And what will you do?" she whispered. "I won't let them take me." His meaning was clear. He would not be taken alive, and the cabin would become a battlefield. They could hear the men shouting outside, now their voices muffled by the storm. "Caleb Donovan, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands high." Clara looked at Jed. She saw the cornered look in his eyes, the look of an animal preparing to fight to the death because it has no other choice. She saw the man who had worked himself to the bone for her, who had listened to her stories, who had made her laugh. And in that instant, a fierce, protective certainty washed over her so powerful it obliterated all the doubt and betrayal. He was not Caleb Donovan the Ghost. He was Jed, her Jed. And this was her ranch. Before he could move for the rifle, she grabbed it herself. She checked the load with a practiced motion, her hands steady. "Stay away from the door," she commanded. Jed stared at her, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. She flung the cabin door open. The wind and snow burst in a furious, icy blast. She stepped onto the porch, the Winchester held at her hip, its barrel pointing toward the assembled men. They sat on their horses, a motley collection of bullies and fools, their faces red with cold and whiskey. "Bart Higgins, you get yourself and your trash off my land." Clara's voice rang out, clear and sharp, as breaking ice. cutting through the howl of the wind. Bart sputtered, taken aback by her ferocity. "Clara May, get back inside. This ain't your business. We're here for the outlaw. He's a danger to you." "The only danger I see is a pack of armed drunks on my porch," she retorted. "This man is under my roof and my protection. He's my husband." The words hung in the frozen air, stunning the posse into silence. Even Jed, standing in the doorway behind her, froze in shock. The lie was audacious, insane, and utterly absolute. Bart Higgins stared, his jaw slack. Your husband. You've lost your mind, woman. He's Caleb Donovan. He's Jedediah Stone." "My husband," Clara repeated, her gaze unwavering, her grip on the rifle tight. "We were married by a traveling preacher a month ago. Now I'm telling you for the last time. Get off my property before I start seeing you as trespassers. And I shoot trespassers." There was no bluff in her voice, no hint of fear in her stance. There was only the cold, hard promise of violence. The men shifted uneasily on their horses, looking from Clara's determined face to Bart's sputtering one. This wasn't the easy reward they'd been promised. Just as the standoff reached its breaking point, another figure emerged from the blizzard. It was Sheriff Brody, his face grim, a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. He'd had second thoughts and followed the posse's tracks. "Bart, what in the hell do you think you're doing?" Brody yelled. "Disperse this mob and get back to town before I arrest every last one of you for inciting a riot." Grumbling, defeated and sobered by the sight of the sheriff's shotgun, the posse began to turn their horses around. Bart gave Clara one last look of pure hatred before wheeling his bay and disappearing into the snow. Sheriff Brody dismounted, his eyes falling on Jed in the doorway. "Ma'am," he said to Clara, nodding respectfully. He then fixed his gaze on Jed. "I don't know what the truth of the matter is, but that poster is real. When this storm clears, son, you and I are going to have a long talk in my office." Jed nodded. "I'll be there, Sheriff." Brody gave a final nod and mounted up, vanishing into the storm after the others. Clara closed the door, the silence in the cabin now profound. The adrenaline drained away, leaving her trembling. She leaned the rifle against the wall and turned to face Jed. He was looking at her with an expression of such raw, overwhelming emotion that it made her heart ache. "Why," he whispered, "why did you do that?" "Because they were wrong," she said, her voice soft. "What you were is not who you are. And I couldn't stand by and watch them kill the man who taught me how to laugh again." The lie she had told to save his life had revealed the truth of her own heart. In that moment, she knew it was no lie at all. It was a promise. The spring thaw came late that year, but when it came, it was glorious. The snow receded, revealing the sleeping earth beneath. The creek, freed from its icy prison, rushed and gurgled. Green shoots pushed their way through the mud, and the air smelled of damp soil and new beginnings. True to his word, the day the trail cleared, Jed rode to Redemption Gulch with Clara at his side. He walked into Sheriff Brody's office and told him everything. The story, corroborated by a telegram to the authorities in Colorado, painted a different picture. News had come that the true killer from the stagecoach robbery, one of Kane's lieutenants, had been caught and had confessed, implicating Silas Kane and clearing the name of the young horseholder, Caleb Donovan, of the most serious charges. Jed, or Caleb, was still wanted for his association with the gang, but with his testimony against Kane, the sentence was lenient. He served 60 days in the territorial jail. Clara ran the ranch alone for those 2 months, the work harder than ever, but her heart was no longer heavy with loneliness. It was filled with a patient, certain hope. He returned on a bright afternoon in May. Clara was in the corral working with a young colt when she saw him walking up the path. He was thinner, but he stood tall, and his pale eyes were clear and free of ghosts. He walked right up to the fence, his gaze meeting hers. He vaulted the fence and walked toward her. The colt shied away, leaving the two of them alone in the center of the corral. "You called me your husband in the dead of winter to save my life," Jed said, his voice quiet but full of feeling. He reached out and took her calloused hands in his. "I'm calling you my wife in the spring, because you are my life." Clara May Thompson looked at Jedediah Stone, the stranger the wind had brought to her door, and saw her future. She saw a lifetime of shared sunrises of hard work, side by side of filling the silence with love. "Welcome home, husband," she said, and her smile was as bright and as promising as the spring day itself. The summer and autumn that followed were a season of quiet healing. The lie Clara had told in the heart of the blizzard became their truth in the long, sun-drenched days. In late July, Circuit Judge Abernathy passed through Redemption Gulch, and they stood before him in the dusty street, their hands clasped, and made it official. Clara May Thompson became Clara May Stone. The town watched their whispers, now more of grudging respect than scandal. The Stones, as they were now known, worked. They turned the Thompson Creek Ranch into a thriving enterprise through sheer, relentless effort. The fences were stronger, the herd was fatter, and for the first time in years, the ledger in Clara's office showed a respectable profit. The partnership that had been forged in survival blossomed in peace. They moved as one, their days filled with the shared language of hard work, their nights with a quiet, deepening intimacy. The ghosts that had haunted Jed's pale eyes seemed to recede, replaced by the steady warmth of a man who has found his place in the world. He moved out of the barn and into the cabin, into her room, into her life. The small home, once a bastion against loneliness, became a sanctuary for their shared love. But a shadow has a long reach, as autumn bled the color from the aspens, leaving them skeletal against the sharp blue sky. A chill returned that had nothing to do with the changing seasons. It began with a story from a freighter passing through his wagon, laden with winter supplies. He spoke of raids and robberies to the south near the Colorado border. He spoke a name that made the coffee cup in Jed's hand tremble. Silas Kane. The gang was active again, bolder than ever. From that day on, Clara noticed a change in Jed. The peace he had found seemed to fray at the edges. He started sleeping lighter, waking at the slightest sound. When he looked out across the valley, his gaze was no longer just that of a rancher checking his herd, but that of a sentry watching for an enemy. He began wearing Frank's old colt again, not just when he rode the fence line, but all the time a grim weight on his hip. "He won't come this far north," Clara said one evening, trying to soothe the worry that coiled in her own stomach. "There's nothing for him here." "You don't know him, Clara," Jed replied, his voice low. "Kane doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive. To him, I'm not just a deserter. I'm a loose end, and he's a man who ties up his loose ends." The way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. The first snow had just fallen, a light dusting that clung to the dark earth when the stranger arrived. He didn't stumble out of a blizzard like Jed had. He rode in on a strong black horse, leading a pack mule. He was dressed well in a thick wool coat and a clean hat. He looked more like a merchant than a drifter. But as he drew closer, Clara felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her gut. There was a stillness about him, an unnatural calm that was more menacing than any open hostility. He reined in his horse near the porch where Clara and Jed stood, having just finished their morning chores. He tipped his hat. "Folks," he said, his voice smooth as polished river stone. "Name's Marcus Thorne. My apologies for the intrusion. I seem to have lost my bearings heading for the pass." Jed stepped forward, slightly positioning himself between the man and Clara. "Pass is closed," Jed said, his voice flat. "First snows saw to that." Thorne smiled a thin, knowing smile that didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were dark and flat, like chips of obsidian. "Is that so a pity? Guess I'll have to wait for the thaw." His gaze swept over the ranch, lingering on the sturdy barn, the healthy-looking cattle. "This is a fine-looking place you have here. Takes a lot of work to keep a spread like this going." His eyes settled on Jed, a flicker of something cold and sharp in their depths. "You look like a man who understands hard work." "Caleb." The name dropped into the crisp morning air, like a stone into a silent pool. Jed went rigid, his hand hovering near the butt of his colt. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "The name is Jedediah Stone." Jed said, his voice a low growl. Thorne's smile widened. "Of course. My mistake. You just bear a striking resemblance to a man I used to know. A fella who had a habit of disappearing. They called him the Ghost. Funny thing about ghosts, though. They always leave something behind. A trail, a scent. Silas Kane has a very keen sense of smell when it comes to money. Or traitors. The pretense was gone. This man was a wolf, and he was done wearing sheep's clothing. "What do you want?" Clara demanded, her voice shaking but firm. She would not let this man see her fear. Thorne turned his flat black eyes on her. "Ma'am, what I want is for my old friend Caleb to understand the situation. Silas feels abandoned, betrayed. He sent me as a courtesy, you understand, a professional courtesy. He wants to extend an invitation for Caleb to rejoin the fold. All is forgiven. He values loyalty, and he's willing to forgive a momentary lapse in judgment." "I'm not going anywhere," Jed said. "I was afraid you might say that," Thorne said, his voice taking on a regretful tone that was utterly false. He swung a leg over his horse, dismounting with a slow, deliberate grace. He walked closer, his spurs silent in the thin layer of snow. "See, the thing is, Silas is a businessman. He looks at this situation, and he sees a liability. A man who knows his operations, who has testified against one of his lieutenants. A man who could, in theory, testify against him. That's a debit on the ledger. And Silas always balances his books." He stopped just a few feet away, his gaze flicking to Clara. "And now, the liability has grown. He's got a wife, a ranch, roots. Things that can be threatened. Things that can burn." The threat was no longer veiled. It was as sharp and as real as the cold air in their lungs. Jed's hand clamped down on the handle of his gun. "You take one more step and I'll send you to hell." Thorne just chuckled, a low, rasping sound. "That's the fire I remember. But you're thinking too small, Caleb. This isn't about you and me. This is about him. Silas Kane is not a man you fight. He's a storm you endure, or you get out of its path. Right now, you've built your house in the middle of a hurricane's path. That night, the cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. The weight of Thorn's threat pressed in on them. He had taken a room at the saloon in Redemption Gulch, a patient spider waiting in his web. "We have to run," Jed said, his voice ragged with guilt. He was pacing the floor, his movements agitated. "I have to leave. I'll draw them away from you from this place. This is my fight, Clara. I never should have brought it to your door." Clara stood up and grabbed his arms, forcing him to stop to look at her. "No," she said, her voice fierce. "You listen to me. When I was Clara May Thompson, I was alone. I was afraid of Bart Higgins, afraid of the winter, afraid of the silence. I'm not that woman anymore. I am Clara May Stone, and this is my home. Our home. I didn't just save you from the snow, Jed. You saved me from a life of loneliness. We built this together. If a storm is coming, we face it together." His shoulders slumped, and he pulled her into a desperate embrace. "He'll kill you to get to me. Then he'll have to get through me first," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. Her strength was the anchor he needed. The hunted look in his eyes was replaced by a hard, cold resolve. This was no longer about running. It was about making a stand. The next morning, Thorn rode back out to the ranch. He didn't bother with pleasantries this time. He sat on his horse, a silhouette of menace against the morning sun. "I spoke with Silas last night via telegraph," he said. "He's disappointed. He's given you a choice. One last choice. You ride out with me today and your wife lives. The ranch is forgotten. Or you stay. And he will come. Not with one man, but with all of them. He will burn this valley to the ground to get to you. He told me to tell you that he will make an example of this place, an example of what happens to those who betray him." Jed stepped off the porch, his hand resting on his Colt, his body a study in defiant calm. Clara was right behind him, the Winchester held loosely in her hands, its cold weight a familiar comfort. "Here's my answer," Jed said, his voice ringing with clarity in the cold air. "You tell Silas Kane that Caleb Donovan is dead. He died in a blizzard a year ago. My name is Jedediah Stone. I'm a rancher, and I'm not leaving my home." Thorn stared at them for a long, silent moment. He saw the unity in their stance, the unyielding steel in their eyes. He saw two people who had drawn a line in the dirt, a line they were willing to die for. He gave a slow nod, a flicker of something that might have been reluctant respect in his dark eyes. "I'll deliver the message," he said. He turned his horse his back, a rigid line of departure. As he rode away, his final words drifted back to them, carried on the wind. "And may God have mercy on your souls." Clara and Jed stood together watching him disappear over the rise. The threat was no longer a distant shadow. It was a promise. Silas Kane was coming. The peace was over. The real storm was about to break. The story of Clara and Jed is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest risks lead to the most profound rewards. It's a tale of redemption, proving that a person's past doesn't have to define their future. In the harshest of winters, in the loneliest of places, two lost souls found not just shelter, but a home in each other. They remind us that trust is a choice. Love is an action, and a true partnership can overcome any storm. If their journey from desperation to devotion moved you, please give this video a thumbs up to let us know. Share it with someone who loves a story of resilience and hope. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next tale from the heart of the Old West. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.